Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is David Littman, and I'm a senior analyst at CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. With over 40 years of experience and countless successful corrections under our belt, CAMRA has been expertly analyzing the problem of media bias, working to combat the problem of distorted coverage, and mobilizing supporters to help push back and hold media outlets accountable. Few are as articulate and thoughtful on the subject as today's speaker, Adam Levick, who is here today to talk about one of the ways in which Western media skews its coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Specifically, Adam will be exploring how the media whitewashes Palestinian responsibility for the ongoing conflict. Adam lives in Israel and is co-editor of CAMRA UK. He previously worked as a researcher at NGO Monitor, and prior to that, at the Civil Rights Division of the Anti-Defamation League. He's had op-eds published in numerous Jewish and non-Jewish publications, published longer papers at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs on anti-Semitism in progressive blogs and anti-Semitic cartoons in progressive blogs, and was previously a member of the online anti-Semitism working group for the Global Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism. He frequently gives presentations about media bias and anti-Semitism, including one last September at the inaugural conference of the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Adam, it's a real pleasure to be here to moderate for you. The floor is all yours.
Thanks very much, David. I appreciate it. All right, so on July 31st, just a couple of weeks ago, thousands of Palestinians in Gaza City and Khan Yunis took to the streets to protest chronic power shortages, difficult living conditions, and it provided a very rare public display of discontent with the territory's authoritarian Hamas government. Now, the protests, unfortunately, were crushed by police, unfortunate but not surprisingly, consistent with the Islamist government's iron fist rule over its more than 2 million Palestinian residents. Now, you may not have heard about it because, save one or two outlets, the story was largely ignored by the mainstream media. Now, why is that? Why would media outlets, whose job it is to report about Israel and the Palestinians, and who typically never miss a chance to publish stories about Palestinian suffering and deprivation, not deem it newsworthy that scores of Palestinians took enormous risks by demonstrating against their extremist Islamist regime that controls their lives? Well, the reason for me seems quite clear, because Israel couldn't be blamed. Indeed, as I'll explain, one of the major elements of anti-Israel media bias isn't about Israel at all, at least not explicitly. It concerns the media's coverage of Palestinians, or more precisely, its failure to devote real, in-depth coverage to Palestinian affairs, including the irresponsible and often destructive decisions by the Palestinian leadership that hurts ordinary Palestinians and serves as enormous impediments to peace. Now, this narrow framing of Palestinians as merely victims, that is, their unwillingness to critically scrutinize Palestinian society with the same powerful lens that they apply to Israeli society, denies news consumers vital insight into the region as well as insight into the root cause of the conflict. Now, the erasure of Palestinian responsibility and agency, be it at the UN, within so-called human rights organizations, or in the mainstream media, not only grossly distorts the public's understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also represents what's been referred to as the bigotry of low expectations, or within another political context as woke racism. Now, both those terms represent ways of describing the refusal to expect certain minorities or any groups deemed rightly or wrongly as oppressed or disadvantaged to meet the same standards of moral behavior set for most people. Now, this isn't in any way to deny that many such groups face real discrimination, only that they, like all individuals, have choices, and to judge their behavior by lower standards than we judge others denies their full humanity, which is, I think, at least I would argue, racism in its most basic form. Now, here's a list of some of the destructive Palestinian decisions and actions, usually by the government, that are erased or at least really downplayed by the media outlets. Number one, the Second Intifada's eruption during the height of the Oslo peace process and just after Ehud Barak offered Arafat a state. Now, this is important because the Second Intifada, which let's remember was a 5-year orchestrated Palestinian campaign of violence targeting Israeli civilians, including children, contradicts the media narrative that Palestinians engage in violence over frustration with the failure of the peace process, a mantra they repeat continually. Now, more than any single factor, it's been persuasively argued, the carnage of the Second Intifada, again, I want to remind you, coming as it did around the same time that Palestinians were being offered a state, soured Israelis on Palestinian intentions and traumatized a generation of Israelis. Let's make this clear. Palestinian decisions and actions help produce an Israeli reaction. The Intifada, if it's mentioned at all, is never attributed to Palestinian decisions or behavior, but often described as something that was sparked by then Foreign Minister Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount. All right, so first, this is inaccurate, as Palestinian leaders later admitted that the Intifada was pre-planned by Yasser Arafat and that Sharon's visit was just a pretext. But additionally, and this is just as important, such an explanation doesn't make sense from a purely rational standpoint. How can one Israeli leader's peaceful visit for 20 minutes to Judaism's holiest site be the cause of a subsequent 4-year campaign of Palestinian violence? Violence which was carried out by thousands of individual Palestinian actions during those days, weeks, and months, and years after Sharon's visit. Again, the Palestinians involved in that Intifada had agency, and they made decisions to carry out murderous attacks. Attacks which soured Israeli feelings about the peace process. Number 2, Israeli peace offers rejected by Palestinian leaders. Again, I want to stress you can't properly contextualize Israel's continuing control of the disputed territories without acknowledging that Israel tried very hard to end the occupation by offering Palestinians practically everything they asked for territorially, but were rebuffed 3 times in 2000, 2001, and 2008 by Palestinian leaders. Yet media outlets, for some reason, rarely mention this fact, despite it being extremely relevant to understanding Israeli public opinion and government policy, as well as the factors involved in the moribund peace process. Now, as with the Second Intifada, Palestinian leaders who said no to Israeli proposals that would have created, let's remember, for the first time in history, a sovereign Palestinian state in almost all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, and with a capital in East Jerusalem, had a profound impact on the Israeli psyche, convincing many that the Palestinian Authority was never truly serious about working towards a peaceful 2-state solution. Now, I want to also stress in this context that additional media efforts to absolve Palestinians of responsibility for the death of Oslo include the claim that the murder of Yitzhak Rabin killed the peace process, a claim that's demonstrably false by the mere glance at the timeline. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered in 1995. Israeli peace offers, that is, the culmination of the Oslo Accords, occurred in 2000, 2000, 2008, years after the assassination. So again, the timeline just doesn't work. Number 3, Palestinian anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry by Palestinian officials and among the population. Indeed, I've often argued within my posts at Camera UK and elsewhere that if you're not prepared to seriously discuss the degree to which anti-Semitism permeates Palestinian society, then you can't have a real conversation about the conflict. According to very reputable polls, a staggering 93%, that's 93% of Palestinians hold anti-Semitic views, the highest percentage of any country or territory in the world. Within this poll, for example, it's been shown that a staggering 78% of Palestinians believe the statement that Jews are responsible for most of the world wars, and 88% believe Jews have too much power over global affairs. Now, not only does this widespread Palestinian acceptance of anti-Jewish racism and conspiracy theories erode the chances of peace, it also, I'd argue, prevents their society from moving forward in any real way. There's a prolific public intellectual named Walter Russell Mead, and he's argued, again, I think persuasively, that societies that are in thrall to such conspiratorial explanations for why things go wrong will never truly understand how the world really works and what steps they must take as collectives or as individuals to solve their real-world problems. In fact, in that spirit, I would argue, we should consider such widespread Palestinian acceptance of conspiracy theories about Jews or anything else as akin to a cognitive impediment to peace and progress. It literally holds them back. I want to also briefly add that such Palestinian anti-Semitism isn't the only form of intolerance that's widespread in Palestinian society. For instance, a BBC News Arabic poll published in 2019 found that only 5% of Palestinians in the West Bank find homosexuality to be morally acceptable, the lowest percentage of the Arab countries and territories surveyed. So, within a Western media landscape in which opposition to all forms of bigotry is the accepted or at least stated norm, for some reason, even the most egregious expressions of Palestinian bigotry and racism is routinely ignored. And you have to ask yourself why. Factor number 4, PA incitement to violence and paid to slay. As many of you know, in Palestinian mosques and state-controlled media outlets, in school textbooks, and in comments publicly by Palestinian officials and in messages sent routinely to Palestinians is one explicitly encouraging terrorism against Israel. Now, this is not an opinion, but a fact, one which is continually documented on sites such as Palestinian Media Watch. Similarly, with the PA's pay to slay scheme, terrorism is literally incentivized. The more money going to prisoners who committed the worst and most violent crimes against Israelis. Conversely, there is little or no peace messaging, certainly not by the Palestinian government, nor by a Palestinian left, if there's anything resembling a left wing within Palestinian society. There's nobody pushing for coexistence in two states. Yet the media's list of root causes for the conflict rarely, if ever, includes Palestinian leaders' inculcation of hate and their glorification of violence, nor do they ever explain why a government which truly desires peace with Israel would devote so much financial and political resources in an effort to convince Palestinians that Jews are their enemy and that jihad is the highest calling. Sadly, that's a question that's almost never asked. Number 5, the rise of Hamas after Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. Recall that after Israel's painful withdrawal from Gaza, a plurality of Palestinians in legislative elections voted for the terrorist group Hamas, a group which soon violently wrestled control of the territory from Fatah, which of course resulted in thousands upon thousands of rockets being fired at Israeli civilians and several rounds of war. Again, this is important because it contradicts the assumption that 1, Israeli control of territory is the main obstacle to peace, and 2, that Israeli withdrawals will necessarily lead to peace. Now, we of course take no position on territorial withdrawal, but the media's failure to provide vital context on the real-life consequences of Israelis of previous withdrawals denies news consumers the chance to understand Israeli decision-making in any substantive sense. Factor number 6, Hamas's destructive role. Ideology, corruption of the Palestinian Authority, crackdowns on journalists, human rights activists, protesters, and dissidents, and their own failure to hold elections. Now, over 2 million Palestinians live under the authoritarian Islamist rule of Hamas. Millions more Palestinian lives are impacted by the undemocratic, unaccountable, and corrupt government of Ramallah. Yet, per the failure of the mainstream media to report on such Palestinian on Palestinian oppression, per my example in the opening, news consumers will be forgiven for thinking that the only dynamic relevant to the Palestinians relates to Israel's control of territories in the West Bank and their partial blockade of Gaza. It seems that Palestinian suffering only matters when that suffering can be weaponized against Israel. Dynamic number 7, polls showing that more Palestinians support a new intifada than support two states. Typically news outlets will use the formula, and this is true of news outlets in the US and wire services and in the UK and elsewhere. They use the formula that Palestinians want a state in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, as if that wish was shared by all or most Palestinians. Now, that may be the Palestinian Authority's bullet point for Western audiences, but there's little evidence of significant support for an outcome that would include any outcome that would include the continuation of the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. In fact, a joint Israeli-Palestinian poll published just this year shows that 40% of Palestinians support a new intifada versus 33% who support a two-state solution. But I think even more tellingly within this poll, 90% of Palestinians think that their suffering grants them the right to do anything they deem as necessary for survival. A sense of moral impunity continually reinforced and nurtured by media coverage of the conflict. Number 8, Palestinian ideology, question mark. Israelis and Israeli MKs, rightly or wrongly, are often called by the media as far right, extreme right, ultra-nationalist, extremist, or extremist settlers. Again, rightly or wrongly. However, on the other hand, Palestinians are almost never assigned an ideological label of any kind. They're just Palestinians. In fact, even Palestinian members of proscribed terror groups, such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, are merely called militants, rather than a term which would be far more accurate and edifying, such as anti-Semitic extremists, an accurate term to describe groups such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, given that, for instance, Hamas, based on polls, garners considerable support among the Palestinian public, it would be reasonable for the media to conclude that support for anti-Semitic extremism is a huge problem in the Palestinian territories, which it could be argued serves as an organic impediment to peace. But such intuitive understandings of Palestinian society are rarely, if ever, grasped by those whose job it is to report accurately and honestly about such dynamics. All right, so this leads us to the question. I think it's a very important question, one that's almost never asked. That is, what can Palestinians, and especially Palestinian leaders, do to contribute to peace and to end the occupation? That is, what is in their power to do? Well, the sad fact is that this question is rarely even asked. And the list I'm about to provide is not an exhaustive one, but it represents, I think, a crucial paradigm by which to view and judge commentary about Palestinians and the choices, repeat that word, choices they make and can make. Now, these ideas also serve as a corrective to the media's historical amnesia that informs their framing of Israeli skepticism over Palestinian tensions as Israeli intransigence and Israel's supposed move right or increased racism rather than the trauma of the Second Intifada, frustration over the PA's rejection of peace offers, and the Palestinian culture of incitement. All right, so now for the list of what Palestinian leaders can do. They can hold elections for the first time in 17 years. It's within their power to do that. Israel is not holding them back. Number two, the PA can begin a process of building transparent, democratic, and truly liberal institutions, a healthy civil society in preparation for statehood, much the way that early Zionist leaders did in pre-state Israel. The Palestinian Authority can also cease promoting and incentivizing terrorism, such as pay to slay. Again, it is in their power to do so and is in their interest to do so. Number four, the Palestinian Authority can cease promoting anti-Semitism. Number five, the PA can announce that they're open to peace talks with Israel without preconditions. Number six, the PA can encourage coexistence projects with Israelis. Number seven, Palestinians of all stripes can reject Hamas and all such groups which represent an immutable obstacle to peace. Now, I want to be clear that there are, of course, many things Israelis and Israel's government can do to promote peace, and absolutely nothing in this presentation is meant to suggest otherwise. However, the current discourse, particularly within the media, already focuses almost entirely on what Israel should do. So it's important to see Palestinians as moral actors to incentivize them to make decisions most likely to lead to peace. It's vitally important and urgent that journalists, commentators, and the general public cease to see Palestinians merely as victims or merely as symbols or abstractions. Indeed, more broadly, I'd argue, we spend too much time, given today's political and intellectual climate, viewing people narrowly as avatars of their identity categories, rather than as complex and flawed individuals possess agency and whose merit can be earned solely by their decisions and actions. The ultimate irony is that pro-Palestinian activists and their supporters in the media sometimes claim that all they desire is for Palestinians to be humanized, while simultaneously, however, infantilizing them and imagining that the normal laws of causality, what a writer named Rob Henderson describes as the reliable connection between good choices and good outcomes and bad choices and bad outcomes, don't apply to their situation. A more dehumanizing portrayal of Palestinians would be hard to imagine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Adam. That was a fantastic overview of the situation and a lot of fascinating insight into the phenomenon. We've had questions pouring in, and I want to encourage all the members of the audience to keep posting any questions that may have arisen during the presentation. So I want to jump right into the questions so we can get as many as we can. So I want to begin with the question of, why do you think that individual journalists don't critically scrutinize Palestinians and their leaders the way they scrutinize Israelis and their leadership?
All right, so I think that there's several factors, but I think many within the media community and the circles that they travel kind of oftentimes view the conflict as a Manichaean paradigm. They view Israel as the oppressors and Palestinians as the victims, full stop. And I think many of them also see it's their job to, as they would say, speak truth to power or comfort the afflicted while afflicting the comfortable. So I think they've adopted consciously, subconsciously, for intellectual reasons, for just following the herd, this really simplistic paradigm in which they think not only that Palestinians are the victims 100%, but they think that their job is to not just report, but to advocate. A lot of them see their job as an extension of their activism. So when they're covering a conflict, I think they want to, make sure that they're seen as being on the right side of history, the right side of the conflict. I think they would even view any pushback against their coverage, their sympathetic coverage with Palestinians, as almost being cruel or bigoted. I think there's this failure to hold them responsible. I mean, I think there's a lot of dynamics, but I think ultimately it's this binary view of the conflict, which has no relation to reality, in my view. And this, again, this Manichaean framing of life and of the conflict as one of oppressor versus oppressed. And I think that gets in the way of what, I think a lot of journalists could possibly do. That is report fairly, report accurately, take a look at the history. So I think these kind of intellectual, political, and sociological factors are at play. I don't know that many of the journalists who cover the region would necessarily agree with that, but in my 13 years of covering the media, it just seems like an inescapable conclusion.
Right, right. And it reminds me of the narrative that I guess we've heard in recent years, particularly around the May 2021 conflict of the power discrepancy argument, right? Where the separate standards were applied to Israel and none were applied to Palestinians because one party was perceived as more powerful. And that is kind of a logic that I think we see proliferating not just in the media, but elsewhere too. Another question, which is interesting, is we're asked, are journalists being intimidated, and how is this playing into what we're talking about today? And I know we've heard of situations of Hamas intimidating journalists in various situations during the conflicts and beyond. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
It's hard for me to know with any degree of accuracy, but based on what we do know, we know that is a factor. There were reports during Operation, I think it was Protective Edge in 2014, of journalists acknowledging that they were being intimidated by their Hamas handlers. We also know that, for instance, I just posted a piece at Camera UK recently about a journalist who contributes to The Independent, a news outlet in the UK, which I showed over the course of 5 long articles about the suffering of Palestinians and Palestinian women in Gaza, managed to avoid using the word Hamas even once in like 5,500 words of text over 5 years. And he was reporting from Gaza. So I don't think you need to do too much math to connect the dots to realize that, it's just not, it just doesn't make sense to report about the oppression, say, of women or the oppression of other minorities from Gaza without mentioning that, they're being ruled by an Islamist authoritarian regime that's misogynistic, anti-Semitic, and is intolerant of other religions. So I think there are a combination of journalists that have gone public with the intimidation experience over the years, along with just reading between the lines and just intuiting based on their, really just light coverage of Hamas's impact on Palestinian lives. That's definitely a factor. But getting back to your previous question, I would argue that I think it's more of a mindset than it is that they're being, say, threatened, with bodily harm. I think the intimidation is probably more subtle than that. Maybe access is threatened. But again, I'm a big believer, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk is because I believe that ideas more than anything else move the world. And I think that the media community is impacted by some really bad ideas about how the world works, about not just specifically about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but about their role in reporting the news, about who's to be sympathized with, who's not to be sympathized with. And I think it's that mindset more than Hamas intimidation, although I think that's a factor that informs a lot of the bad coverage of Israel that we report about all the time at camera.
Right, right. And related to Hamas and Gaza, we have a question about why doesn't the public realize Gaza doesn't belong to Israel and isn't occupied, and therefore hold Gazans responsible for their own failure I guess, of Gaza, of their own governance in Gaza.
Well, unfortunately, I think, Dave, you probably can comment on this more because you have an international legal background, but there were international opinions that described Gaza as still occupied by Israel, which just, as a non-legal expert, just strikes me as just so perverse, it's hard to even describe. So, there's that, right? Like the media outlets can claim that Gaza is still occupied, which defies, just the facts on the ground, defies all logic. And we really can't even push back against it, really, because they can just cite the international opinions. But again, I think even without that, I just think it almost doesn't matter. I just think that they're institutionally incapable of holding Palestinians responsible for their own actions, even in the case where an authoritarian regime such as Hamas is ruling with an iron fist. So I think part of it is those ridiculous international rulings. But I think part of it also goes back to the substance of my talk, which is this blind spot, this bigotry of low expectations in which Palestinians are seen merely as victims. That I think that's ultimately what drives everything else.
A related point I'm curious about, and this question is, I'm taking the moderator's privilege here and asking one of my own. You mentioned about journalists saying that Palestinians want a two-state solution. They want a state with the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza as their state, when the polls are much more complex than that. They don't actually show that. And is there an element, do you think, of not just denying them agency, but projection? And I think to a particular example that we have dealt with, that I dealt with at CNN, where Christiane Amanpour effectively made up a poll suggesting exactly that Palestinians want a peaceful two-state solution, when every poll showed that no, by far and away, most of them want a one-state solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for lots of reasons, I think the narrative that they craft within the articles they write is kind of dependent upon the assertion that Palestinians, all they want is a peaceful two-state solution, right? Otherwise, that would raise all sorts of thorny questions. Like, why are they committing acts of terrorism against Israel? I think, Maddie Friedman, who wrote a fantastic piece in Tablet in 2014 that everybody should read, basically put it clear, and he was a Jerusalem correspondent for AP for a number of years. He said that the media has decided, or that elite commentators have decided, that Palestinians want a state and only a state, and the fact that the reality is more complicated than that doesn't get in the way of them advancing that. So I think it serves as a convenient way to kind of square the circle, right? To allow for the narrative to have some intellectual coherence. And it's also kind of that we push back and we cite polls. It's something that they'd be really resistant from ever acknowledging that. Unfortunately, the evidence is quite the opposite. The evidence is that a lot of Palestinians who even want a state, wouldn't want a state if it included a state of Israel alongside of the Palestinian state. So I think it's just because it's required to tell the story they want to tell.
Right. Well, one of the other questions we have is, one of the biggest problems are NGOs which intensely promote the whole victim oppressor paradigm. And the questioner asks, they describe these as very manipulative and seductive organizations, because they proclaim to be seeking peace and justice. And they wonder how we can address these and other anti-Israel NGOs that might be feeding into some of these broader narratives that we're discussing.
Well, I think Camera has done a good job of, for instance, when B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International falsely accused Israel of being an apartheid state, I think we pushed back really well and refuted those charges line by line. The problem is, of course, that media outlets will cite Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, or Amnesty, and almost never cite criticism of these NGOs by CAMA or NGO Monitor or any such group. So, the answer is that it's really hard. As long as these NGOs have, continued to maintain their hallow, their metaphorical hallow, it's hard to push back against it. But the only thing that we can do is to continually challenge them on their factual assertions, which are often based on, just flat out lies, misinterpretations of law, etc., and really expose the corruption at the core of what's known as the human rights industry. The problem is, I think I'm glad that was asked. That's a big problem, is because when people see the words Human Rights Watch, I don't think many people stop to think, well, this organization actually is a shadow of what it once was. That its former founder denounced the organization's obsession with Israel and said that it lost its way. This was in 2009. Look, the only thing we can do is just to continue to inform ourselves and push back by noting how far these previously realistic and truth-telling organizations have lost their way and were corrupted by radical ideologies, and just push back the way we've been doing. Unfortunately, I think it really is an uphill battle.
Right. The next question is, how can we incorporate your points that you elaborated earlier in the media's narrative to create a more accurate narrative? And the questioner also asks, would federal laws about accuracy help? Of course, that seems a little bit like a question for American law, but feel free to answer that. I know you have some interest in that subject.
All right. So the second question first. All right. So, in the U.S., there's obviously the First Amendment, which, again, you as an international law expert know a lot more than I do, but I don't think that such an effort to, if I understood the question, to criminalize or sanction media outlets for not telling the truth, I don't think that would pass constitutional muster. I think that would also go against the American ethos. However, in the UK, there is a different culture, right? There isn't a First Amendment. There is an organization in the UK called IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization. It's a publicly funded body, and their job is to adjudicate complaints against media outlets by news consumers if those complaints weren't handled by the media outlet themselves in a way that was satisfactory to the complainant. Now, even that's not a perfect system, because media outlets have to sign up and they have to agree to be monitored by IPSO. And so, for instance, The Guardian decided that they can monitor themselves. Other outlets, such as The Independent, also didn't sign up. The Financial Times didn't sign up. So, but in the UK, there is something, approaching a ethos where there is more pressure put on to correct patently false claims. The problem is, and especially with the BBC, a lot of these mechanisms are toothless and are impossible to navigate and rarely result in good outcomes. So again, if the question was whether there's something in the law that can be done, I don't think, personally, this is my opinion, not Cameron's opinion, I don't think there should be, and I don't think such a law would be effective. As the question is, who's going to be the arbiter of what's false news and what's not false news? As far as the first question, look, part of this, the reason why I wanted to give this demonstration was to arm our supporters, those who are passionate about telling the truth about Israel, with some more rhetorical tools to understand the dynamics at play, and to better understand what's being left out, right? Like, we oftentimes, arm our supporters with facts, right? That's what we do. We provide a forensic take on why it is that media outlets get it wrong. And our hope, and we actively encourage our supporters to contact media outlets and, use the information, the sources that we provide, and sources that they can get on their own to complain, to make our voices heard. Now, there's no magic formula. I think that Cameron does a fantastic job of pushing back against these lies. I think the number of corrections we got last year is somewhere in the vicinity of 245, speaks for itself. But while there's no magic bullet, I would love for people to come away with this with an understanding of that it's not just that Israel is lied about, that it's Palestinians that are just left out of the picture, that they're not taken into account at all. And that not only does that deny news consumers half of the story, but I think it serves as a instructive form of modern day racism. As I said before, I don't want to repeat myself, but I just can't get over when you deny someone the right to have agency imputed upon them, when you deny that they're adults, when you deny that they have more responsibility. I think you're treating them in a way that's less than dignified, that doesn't treat them as a means merely. They're treated as an ends towards an ideological goal. And I think that's a really insidious form of racism. And I think it would be great if, in a temperate, moderate way, our supporters would push back against this double standard, this moral double standard.
Excellent way of putting it. I have a particularly interesting question, and I'm going to expand the question a little bit too. The question was, might the Abraham Accords lead to a change in Palestinian opinions and action? But I'd like to expand it because we saw that the conflict originally began as the Israeli-Arab conflict. It was not just the Palestinians, but the surrounding Arab states. And over the years, we've seen improving relations with the Arab community. And the media coverage has shifted over the many years of the conflict too. And with the improved relations between Israel and these Arab countries in the Gulf and Northern Africa and elsewhere, changing the dynamic and the relations, do you think that might have an effect going forward on the tendency in the West and the media to deny agency to the Palestinians, to those who are in conflict with the Jewish state?
If you would have asked me at the dawn of the Abraham Accords, I might have been somewhat more hopeful. I just have seen no evidence to that effect within public opinion polling of Palestinian society. Conversely, though, there has been some bright spots in polling within the Arab states that joined the Abraham Accords, with attitudes about Israel and Jews improving, with textbooks within their societies becoming less anti-Semitic. So, look, it's hard to predict what's going to happen years down the road, but I'll just say that I don't see any indication now that the Abraham Accords and what that has meant for not just Israeli relations with the Arab world, but what it has meant for Arab society, for countries such as the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. That I don't think that that's been internalized by Palestinian society, or at least there's been no empirical evidence to show that. And certainly I've seen no change in the media's paradigm. I mean, again, I hesitate to say I think there's, things could always change. I wouldn't have predicted the Abraham Accords would have happened a year before it happened, but I don't see any reason to be optimistic, at least right now.
Now, how receptive in your experience have journalists been to, on the one hand, you will send requests for corrections on straight factual issues, for example, claiming that the Western Wall is the holiest site when it's actually the Temple Mount. How receptive have journalists been to criticism of the whole issue we're talking about today, that the way they're covering these issues is denying the Palestinians agency?
Well, it's hard to know because, within my communications with media outlets, I just focus on the factual errors. And, it's kind of hard unless the omission about Palestinian conduct is really, really vital to the story. It's hard to push back against that. It's hard to make the argument I'm making now in a communication with an editor at a British publication or a non-British publication, unless it's vitally relevant. So, look, I think that I try to make this point as much as I can within our website, in op-eds, on Twitter, on Facebook, and with hope, because I'm generally optimistic that these ideas will penetrate. But again, it's hard to make these arguments within limited space that we have and limited bandwidth we have to communicate with these journalists. And every time, as we communicate with media outlets, we're thinking, is this a good use of capital, right? Is this communication going to likely result in a substantive change in their coverage? And I guess I don't think we're at the stage yet where we can kind of insert that dynamic into the conversation. But again, I'm optimistic that, with enough people understanding that this is a big part of the conflict, a big part of the media's framing of the conflict, that I think that those conversations might become possible. They haven't been up until now, in my view.
Right. And related, are there any outlets that you think are exceptions to the media's overall silence about the kind of destructive Palestinian behavior that you described earlier?
There was an article in the Telegraph in the UK, maybe 3 years ago, which reported on something that was reported by Palestinian Media Watch. I forget the exact specifics, but it was something, just a horrible case of incitement within Palestinian society. And I remember we were so shocked because those stories are never told. However, like the fact that I have to go back 3 years to even think of an example of, media outlet, a Jerusalem correspondent holding Palestinians responsible for the destructive decisions of their leaders or destructive decisions of their community, I think just shows, unfortunately, the answer is none. Or at least let's put it this way, I monitor the British media. I'm not aware of any mainstream, large audience British outlet that consistently or even more than once in a blue moon covers the things that we think should be covered. So unfortunately, except for a rare exception, the answer is no.
Now, one question that's come up in a few different ways is, to what degree, in your view, is the media's focus on the sins of Jews in Israel the result of anti-Semitism? How much of this is being driven by anti-Semitism, and is that something that we need to address first before we can address any other questions or any other issues?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question, and it's a complex one. I think first, I just want to preface my answer with saying, we try really hard not to, in lieu of evidence, accuse individual journalists or editors of being anti-Semitic, because we don't know what's going through their mind, and I think that's all ultimately, therefore, an ad hominem attack. We just push back against things that they do, things that they write, things that they say. Sometimes, especially those who are familiar with our Arabic department, know those things that they say on social media can be horrifically anti-Semitic, and has resulted through our work in actually a couple of journalists being fired due to, like, for instance, praising Hitler. So look, clearly within certain elements of the media, particularly the Arabic media, there is just explicit and extreme anti-Semitism that's informing their coverage of Israel. And I think anyone who's interested, there are lots of English language translations of Camera Arabic's work on the main Camera site and on Camera UK. But I think the question of the degree to which anti-Semitism informs the bias against Israel within the non-Arabic media is a complicated one. I do think that in general, there are a couple of dynamics that are at play. There's an academic by the name of Richard Landis who has often used the term moral schadenfreude. There's this joy that some journalists, some commentators seem to get over their freedom now, that you're allowed to vilify Israel, that, all these years after the Holocaust, when, they felt reticent to criticize Jews, to demonize Jews. They feel like, Israel as the Jewish collective is kind of getting their comeuppance, right? That this gives them the license to criticize Jews in a way they couldn't criticize Jews before. So I think there is something about that. I think there also, this power dynamics that you mentioned before, I think is part of it, right? Within the diaspora, a lot of reasons why people don't understand anti-Semitism is because most forms of bigotry, the bigot is punching down. That is, they're accusing the object of their scorn, of their racism, of being stupid or incompetent or inferior racially or ethnically or religiously than other groups, right? But with Jews, right, they're, in a sense, in their minds, they're punching up, right? They're claiming that not that Jews are too weak or too unintelligent or too inferior necessarily. They're saying that Jews are too powerful, right? So similarly, I would argue that a lot of the depictions of Israel also kind of, I would say at the very least, mirror that dynamic of anti-Semitism we see within the diaspora. That is, Israel is at fault because they're too powerful. right? Because their lobbies control the debate. So I think there's definitely this undercurrent within some of the more obsessive criticism of Israel of the same anti-Semitic themes we see within anti-Semitism directed towards the diaspora community, that Jews, or in this case, Israel Jews as the collective, is too powerful, and that and that since they see their role as speaking truth to power, as long as Israel's powerful economically, militarily, diplomatically, in other ways, they feel that it's not really being bigoted by going after the quote unquote powerful Jews. So I think I tried to point to this in my talk, this whole, and I think you mentioned it too, the whole power dynamics is interesting. And I think while I think most of the media outlets and journalists that cover Israel probably don't say explicitly anti-Semitic things, I think there is an undercurrent within their understanding of the conflict that I think at the very least mirrors that of the anti-Semitism we see increasingly in the diaspora.
And related to that, there's that dynamic of that seems to be somewhat seductive to Jews, especially in the United States, especially young Jews, about power dynamics, about the oppressed. And one of the questions has to do with what might be the best way to connect with young Jews about Israel and about the truth on the reporting of Israel, given that so many of them receive so much of their information from these news outlets that are really skewing the coverage, as we're talking about.
Yeah, we obviously, just for people who don't know, we have a campus department that does a very good job of kind of addressing these issues and informing students, informing young people. But let me just do a book plug, a book that really impacted me that I think really addresses the power dynamics, and that is by Ruth Weiss, the book called Jewish Power. I think I got that title right. Maybe Jews in Power. And it's influential because it kind of discusses the reason why many Western diaspora Jews feel uncomfortable with the Jewish state's exertion of political and military power. She argues that, living in the diaspora for so long, many Jews internalize weaknesses, not just a fact of life, but almost as an ideal. And I think a lot of Jews, she argued, have a hard time understanding that, it was weakness that helped bring about the rise of powerful anti-Semites that did destructive things to Jews. And then it's only by being strong that has allowed Israel to thrive, and that has allowed diaspora Jews to, depending on the situation nationally, to thrive also. I think this misunderstanding of what it means to possess and exercise power, both as individuals, as communities, and as the Jewish state, I think is a big problem with the understanding that many young Jews have with Israel. And I think that's the dynamic that needs to be addressed in the context of Jewish history, in the context of the Holocaust, in the context of thousands of years of oppression, that power, if responsibly used and exercised, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And that in the case of Israel, I think its history has shown it's vital to protect what's now, where a plurality of Jews now live, and within a few years will be where a majority of Jews live. And I think I recommend that book, and just to further explore that idea. That's one thing I can think of.
I will second that recommendation to read Anything and Everything by Ruth Weiss, who is a wonderful thinker on these subjects. So I'm glad you recommended her. Big fan of her as well. Now, the next question is, can we go on the offense? That is, can we shine a light on the conflicts around the world that aren't being covered by the media to I guess, kind of force them to rethink, to apply coverage a bit more fairly? And as they point out, when you really look at the numbers, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is quite small in multiple ways.
That's tricky because we, of course, can, and I think to some degree we do. I just don't know if that's necessarily the best strategic decision. I think you can get accused of whataboutism. Again, it's of course true, and it's frustrating, and it's a topic for an entire webinar is, why the focus on Israel, and that gets into some very interesting issues. I just don't know that necessarily, given limited time, energy, space, and bandwidth, that will change hearts and minds. Again, not to say that we should never or that we don't ever mention that, and those comparisons are important, but I think for the time being, I think it's important just to deal with the conflict as it is, within its own reality, its own paradigm, its own fact pattern, its own history. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's a good question and a good point. I just don't think that right now is as effective as just focusing on the conflict and what's being left out about the conflict.
Right, right. Well, you've mentioned that there's a reluctance of media outlets to use kind of ideological pejoratives to describe even the most violent terrorist Palestinians. Now, if you were to challenge a journalist on this, what do you think his or her response might be?
No, that's a really good question. I wish I could ask that question. You know what? I'm really not sure. I'm, and I don't even have a good guess. Like that's a really good question. And maybe the next time I have an opportunity to meet properly with a journalist, I'll ask that. In fact, I think I will. I just don't have an answer because I really don't know. I don't know what their excuse would be. Everything that comes to my mind right now that they would normally use to deflect good questions about the reporting, I just don't know what they would come up with in that point. I know how they would answer why they use the word militant instead of terrorism, but why they don't use any pejorative ideological labels, that's a great question. And maybe next time we have a webinar, I can answer that.
Well, I'm sure there will be more in the future. Now, we have time for a few more questions. One parallel, I guess, Israel is not just, or has not just been in conflict with the Palestinians, but we have also been in conflict with Hezbollah. And that's something that's really kind of creeping up lately, as we've seen with the provocations on the border by Hezbollah. Why, do you see similar trends or patterns or behavior in relation to Israel and Lebanon and Israel and Hezbollah? Is that something that really is similar, or is it just kind of too different of a situation?
Well, it is different for a couple of different reasons, one of which they're not Palestinian. Number two, the Lebanese political situation, of course, is, and the degree to which the country is effectively occupied by the proxy of a foreign power, Iran, is rarely covered, or at least not covered to the extent that it should be. But it is a different dynamic. I mean, I don't know that there's any widespread universal view and coverage of Lebanese people, except for the Palestinians who are registered as refugees. That's in any way similar to the way the Palestinians are reported upon. And I think the fact that Hezbollah aren't Palestinians, I think, kind of changes the way that they're covered. So no, it's definitely, there are some similarities, and I think if and when there is another major war between Israel and Hezbollah, I think you'll probably start seeing some similar coverage as the way it was covered in 2006, focusing on the unfortunate civilian casualties that will probably result from the war, Lebanese casualties. But again, it's a different dynamic because, in the public imagination, there really isn't a sense of what it means to be Lebanese, the way that there is a sense of what it means to be Palestinian. So I think it's kind of different in kind.
Right. Well, as we get towards the end, one of the questions that I think a lot of people have is, what can the average person who may not have a very prominent platform do to push back against the dynamic that we've been focusing on here today, and to bring some attention to what's really happening?
Okay, well, there's a few things. I mean, number one, just read as much as you possibly can. The more information you have at your disposal, the more confident you'll feel. And part of that's reading Camera, part of that's reading other sites that speak honestly about the conflict. So I think once you're armed with the facts, I think there are lots of ways you can push back. You can be part of Camera's team and help us fight back against media bias. You can, if you're comfortable on Twitter or Facebook and other social media outlets, you can use those outlets. And it certainly also helps to write letters to the editor. I think those still matter. But I think the bottom line is to inform yourself, to get the facts, to be part of this pro-Israel conversation, this very moral movement that is made up of Jews and non-Jews who see the injustice of the vilification of Israel for what it is, are outraged and want to do something about it. And I think that certainly going to camera.org and becoming a member is a first step in that. Otherwise, use your own communities. Talk to people in your community, your friends, your family members. Just don't be quiet. The only thing that we can do is to encourage people to speak up once they're armed with the facts. And we're, kind of like the homepage when it comes to facts about Israel. So I hope you look at our content.
Yes, speaking up is something I would encourage too. You're going to lose every argument that you never make. So I want to thank you so much, Adam. This has been a wonderful conversation on what is really such an important topic. And I'd also like to thank the audience for spending their time with us today and for the many, many fascinating questions. As always, you can find us on our website, camera.org, and you can also find a lot of Adam's work on camera-uk.org. You can also find us on Twitter, which I suppose is now also known as X, as well as on Facebook. And as Adam alluded to, we encourage everybody to join our team, join our email team, through which we send out calls to supporters for action to help us combat media bias. And you can join our team by there's a short survey on our website where you can also find other ways to support us. And so with that, I want to say thank you again, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you.